things that were not on my bingo card when I left a high control sect in Victoria: becoming an expert on the difference between religious freedom and coercion. Hi, my name's Heath-McIvor. I co-founded the Australian Cult Survivors Network, and I talk a lot about cults, toxic evangelicalism, Christian nationalism. The Venn diagrams aren't always a circle, but sometimes there's overlap. So let's talk about this. Is there a difference between religious freedom and coercion? Now, this has been on my mind because I flew to Sydney last week to address a forum run by the Anti-Slavery Commissioner on cults and high control groups and the overlap between that and human slavery and human trafficking. The overlaps are terrible and they're definitely there. And I also just came back from regional Victoria, where I ran a cult awareness and intelligence meeting for some local services. And this is a question that comes up a lot. Can we legislate against group-based coercive control? That is the type of coercive control that happens in cults and high control groups, this totalistic domination of a person's entire life, whether that's cognitive, behavioural, emotional, existential, linguistic, social, a whole lot. Yes, we can, because let me tell you, there is a huge difference between free will religion and cults. The first rule of this, I think, is to recognise that nobody in a cult thinks they're in a cult. They think that they're in the group with a higher truth, more greater enlightenment, that sort of thing. Somebody who's been radicalised into a cult or, indoctrinated into a cult is very unlikely to be able to see their own thinking errors and the ways in which their own freedom has disappeared, because meaningful consent disappears in cults. You get love bombed in, and then you get introduced to the more palatable parts of the belief system, and then you go further and further in. But here are some key differences that we see in cults and high control groups that you don't see in free will religion. Let's take, for example, tithing. Tithing is a common practice, always has been. You throw your pennies into the plate when it comes around, and it's totally fine if you're just going, well, this is how much I can give, this is how much this cause means to me, I am checking my own budget, I'm making sure I can feed my kids and pay my rent, and then I'm putting my money into the offering plate. Fine, that's voluntary tithing. It's been happening since the church, began. It's different when you're in a situation where you might be, say, getting a pastor to help with your budget, and they may be seeing every cent that you're spending and advising you on how much you tithe. It's different when you might have an accountability partner who is making sure that you give the required amount. It might be coercion if you, for example, are submitting your entire pay packet to a group and then they're giving you back an allowance. These types of things are coercion. It might be coercion if, say, for example, in smaller churches that they weren't able to pay the pastor the right amount of money, and there's a call around that goes around and pressures people into giving more money. That is a difference between free will religion and coercion. But in our conceptualization of how cults are different from free will religion, there needs to be a pattern of coercion that goes over a few areas. So let's talk about what some of those other areas are. So let's say tithing is one. What about confession? There's a difference between wandering into a Catholic church and saying to a priest, can you take my confession, and knowing that's going to be kept confidentially, in the confessional. Now, there's all sorts of problems with this, like, for example, when crimes are disclosed in there, like offending against children, for example, and that knowledge is not passed on. So I'm not going to comment on that. I'm going to talk about the act of voluntarily going in to a confessional and going, I want to get this off my chest. There's a difference between that and group-based confession, where you might be sitting in a group and you might have to confess your sins or shortcomings in front of a group, and there might be retaliation or humiliation or group-sanctioned sort of penance that is driven down on the person if they've failed in one way. That is a coercive behaviour. Just like coercing somebody's tithes or finances is a coercive behaviour. There's a big difference between the two. You're welcome for hearing my tummy rumbling, by the way. Mama needs to have breakfast or lunch. Another thing is volunteerism. There is a big difference between walking into, say, a local op shop and saying, can I do a few hours here a week, and volunteering to help. That is on one side of the free will religion sort of thing. If you're going to help out a good cause, you're like, this means a lot to me, I want to do this. there's a big difference between that and, say, being forced to do hard labour, or not being able to say no, or feeling pressure based on group coercion or forced confession, or you've failed the cause or you're not working hard enough, where you have to then do hard labour as a form of penance. So it might be scrubbing floors. Scientology would make people do like scrub toilets with toothbrushes and all sorts of things you saw in the Go and Clear documentary, when they were talking about if somebody got thrown in this sort of punishment sort of building. There might be like forced renovations, and when I say forced, you could be laughed at or mocked for your excuses. By the time that you're in the middle of these groups, those excuses are seen as sins and shortcomings, and so there's going to be this internalized God is judging me, or the group is judging me, or I'm going to be socially sort of sanctioned for these things. Big difference between walking into a good cause and going, hey, I want to help out, to no, you must do this, you must be up early to scrub toilets, or you must miss out on sleep to or fast or miss food in order to make up for your wrongdoings, or you must take part in this, whether it's a working bee or, and who cares about your health. Those are coercive acts. And I guess I'm talking not clearly about this because I'm trying not to call out specific groups. I'm trying to, talk about trends that we see across different cults or coercive groups. And in doing so, I'm trying to avoid things that I know about that have happened in specific groups. Lots of fun when you're carrying about 700 stories in your head. Anyway, so there is a massive difference between free will religion and coerced religion. And the problem that we see in cults and high control groups is they can't tell the difference. They think that behavioral, cognitive, emotional, social, obedience to these strict group rules is free will religion, or is the way it needs to be. And that is a huge indicator that you've got somebody who is under a thought reform process, which I'll talk about another day because this video is 7 minutes long. I'm Claire Heath-McIvor. If you like this kind of stuff, follow along.